The sun was a reluctant sliver of orange on the horizon, fighting through the thick fog that clung to the Montana mountainside. Jedediah Stone, a man carved from the same rough granite as the land he inhabited, shivered inside his makeshift shelter. It was more a pile of scavenged timber and frayed tarps than a cabin, a testament to his decade of self-imposed exile, a decade spent in rags, a decade of scraping by on deer jerky and the bitter taste of regret. His face, hidden beneath a matted beard, was a roadmap of lines etched by sun, wind, and sorrow. He awoke to the familiar ache in his bones, a constant companion since he left the world of men behind. The air was frigid, biting his exposed skin. He rose, pulling a ragged wool blanket tighter around his shoulders. His boots, worn thin as paper, crunched on the frozen earth as he stepped outside. The world was silent, save for the distant cry of a hawk. He wasn't lonely in the way a man living in a city might be. His loneliness was a physical weight, a presence that shared his every waking moment and filled the silence with the echoes of his past. Jed's routine was as unyielding as the mountains themselves. He checked his snares, a meager harvest of one rabbit. It would be enough for a day, maybe two if he was careful. His mind, usually a blank expanse, was troubled by a nagging thought. A memory of his father's last words, spoken on the day Jed left. "You'll come back, son. The mountains can't fix what's broken inside you." His father, a man he hadn't seen in 10 years, a man whose death had been relayed to him weeks ago by a passing trapper. Jed had just nodded, the news a distant echo. What did it matter? The past was the past. Just as the sun began to warm the air, a figure emerged from the tree line. It was a local sheriff, a man named Brody, who knew Jed by reputation and little else. Brody's face was grim. "Jedediah Stone?" Brody's voice was gruff, an unwelcome sound in Jed's quiet world. Jed grunted in response. "Got something for you," Brody said, pulling a folded envelope from his coat pocket. "Your father's will. The lawyer in town sent me. Said it was important you get this personally." Jed took the envelope. It felt out of place in his calloused hand, a symbol of a world he had long abandoned. He ripped it open, his eyes scanning the formal legal language. His gaze landed on a single line, and his breath hitched. The words seemed to jump off the page, stark and unbelievable. "I bequeath to my son Jedediah Stone my cabin located on the east bank of the Elk River, along with all its contents, on the condition that he assume the care and guardianship of Sarah Miller, a young woman of the Amish faith." Jed's hands trembled. He read the words again and again. Care and guardianship of Sarah Miller. The very idea was absurd. Him, a guardian? He was barely a man, more an animal eking out an existence. The will went on to explain his father's long-standing friendship with the Miller family and his promise to their matriarch to ensure Sarah's well-being. Jed's father, a man who had loved his son but understood his wild nature, had made a last-ditch effort to pull him back from the brink. Brody watched Jed's face, seeing the shock and disbelief. "Seems your old man had a few tricks up his sleeve, Jed. The girl's already in town, waiting for you. Says she won't go with anyone but the man her benefactor chose." Jed's mind reeled. A cabin, a home, and a girl. A young woman, no less, from a world so alien to his own. He was meant to be her protector. The irony was so bitter, it could choke him. He, who couldn't protect himself from his own demons, was now responsible for another human being. The weight of it settled on his shoulders, heavier than any mountain snow. Where is she?" Jed's voice was a low rasp, unused to forming full sentences. "At the Miller family's temporary stay in town, the preacher's house. She's a quiet one. A bit lost, I think." Jed stood there, the will clutched in his hand, the paper a flimsy connection to a life he had forsaken. The mountains, which had been his sanctuary, now felt like a cage. He was being pulled back into the world he had fled, a world of responsibility, of human connection, of emotions he had tried so hard to bury. A new chapter of his life, one he never asked for, was about to begin. The hand of fate, cold and unyielding, had reached out from beyond the grave and dragged him back to a reality he was utterly unprepared for. The sound of the wind was no longer a comfort. It was a foreboding whisper, a promise of the storm to come. The town of Clearwater was a jarring assault on Jed's senses. The noise of carriages, the smell of cooked food, the sight of people moving with purpose. It was all overwhelming. He felt like a wild animal cornered in a trap. He had traded the silence of the mountains for the cacophony of civilization, a world he no longer understood. He found the preacher's house, a small, whitewashed building with a neatly manicured lawn. It was a picture of order, a stark contrast to the chaos of his life. He hesitated at the gate, his hand hovering over the latch. What was he doing here? What right did he have to take charge of anyone, let alone an Amish girl? He was a creature of the wild, a man who spoke to animals more than people. He pushed the gate open and walked to the front door. The sound of his own heavy footsteps seemed to echo in the stillness. He knocked, the sound loud and out of place. The door opened to reveal a stern-faced man in a simple black suit, a preacher. He eyed Jed with thinly veiled suspicion, his gaze lingering on Jed's ragged clothes and unkempt appearance. "I'm looking for Sarah Miller," Jed said, his voice a low growl. The preacher's eyes narrowed. "And who might you be?" "Jed Stone." The preacher's expression softened slightly, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He stepped back, gesturing for Jed to enter. "She is inside. She has been waiting for you." Jed stepped into the house, and the scent of baked bread and beeswax filled his senses. The interior was clean and simple, with hand-carved wooden furniture and plain white walls. And there, sitting by the window, was Sarah Miller. She was a vision of innocence and grace, a stark contrast to Jed's rugged world. Her dark hair was neatly tucked under a white cap. Her dress was a simple dark blue garment that covered her from neck to ankles. Her face was pale, framed by the white fabric, and her eyes, a deep and liquid brown, were wide with a mix of fear and curiosity. She was impossibly young, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. A silent prayer. Jed felt a pang of something he hadn't felt in years. Shame. He was a disheveled wreck, a man who slept in the dirt, standing before a young woman who was the embodiment of purity. He looked away, feeling the heat rise in his cheeks. The preacher cleared his throat. "Sarah, this is Jedediah Stone, the man your father's friend spoke of." Sarah rose to her feet, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't speak. Her eyes simply held his. She was searching, he realized, looking for something in his face, something that would tell her he was a good man. He knew she wouldn't find it. Jed finally met her gaze. He saw no judgment, only a deep, abiding sadness. She was a lamb being led to the slaughter, and he was the wolf she was being handed to. He felt a desperate urge to run, to flee back to the safety of his solitary life, but the will, the promise to his father, held him in place. I've come to take you to the cabin," Jed said, his voice a rough whisper. Sarah finally spoke, her voice soft and clear, a delicate bell in the room. "My father said I must go with you. He said you are a good man at heart." Jed let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "Your father was a good man. He didn't know me." The preacher interjected, his voice firm. "This is a difficult situation for all involved. Sarah, you must go with him. It is the will of your father's friend, and a promise must be kept." Sarah nodded, her eyes never leaving Jed's face. She picked up a small satchel, her only possession. "I am ready." As they walked out of the house and towards the wagon Jed had borrowed, the townspeople watched from their windows. Whispers followed them, a low hum of gossip and disapproval. It was a man from the mountains, a wild man, leaving with a girl in Amish dress. The combination was unnatural, a violation of unspoken rules. Jed helped her up onto the wagon, his hand brushing against hers. Her skin was soft, a stark contrast to his own calloused hand. He felt a jolt, a spark of something he had long forgotten. He quickly pulled his hand away, his heart pounding in his chest. The ride out of town was silent, a long and awkward journey. Jed focused on the road, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and anger. He had been a free man, bound to nothing and no one. Now he was tethered to this young, innocent woman, a living, breathing testament to his father's final act of intervention. He glanced at Sarah, who sat rigidly beside him, her gaze fixed on the passing scenery, her face a mask of quiet resignation. He saw in her eyes a reflection of his own isolation. She was a stranger in his world, just as he was a stranger in hers. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that the lonely mountain man and the virgin Amish girl were on a collision course, and he had no idea what the wreckage would look like. The journey from town to the cabin was a slow, agonizing trek. The silence in the wagon was a heavy blanket, broken only by the creak of the wheels and the occasional snap of a twig under the horse's hooves. Jed stole a glance at Sarah. She was a vision of quiet grace, a stark contrast to the untamed wilderness around them. Her stillness was unsettling. He was used to the twitching of a squirrel, the flight of a startled bird. She was too calm, too composed. It made him uneasy. As they approached the cabin, Jed braced himself for her reaction. He had expected a hovel, a shack like his old one. But his father's cabin was a marvel of craftsmanship. It was a solid log structure with a stone chimney, a small porch, and a well-tended garden, now overgrown with weeds. It was a home, not just a shelter. A home his father had painstakingly built, perhaps with him in mind. The sight of it filled Jed with a fresh wave of grief and guilt. He pulled the wagon to a halt. "This is it," he said, his voice rough. Sarah looked at the cabin, her expression unreadable. She dismounted with a quiet efficiency that surprised him. She walked towards the cabin, her footsteps light on the dirt path. She ran her hand over the wooden walls, a hint of wonder in her eyes. It was clear she was used to a different kind of life, but she appreciated the solid, honest labor that went into building the home. Jed followed her, his body language tense and guarded. He unlocked the door and pushed it open. The air inside was stale, smelling of dust and old wood. But it was clean. There was a fireplace, a sturdy table with 2 chairs, a bed with a simple quilt, and a small kitchen area with a cast-iron stove. It was more than Jed had ever had. It was a sanctuary, a monument to a father's love. Sarah walked in, her eyes taking in every detail. She set her satchel on the table and turned to Jed. "It is a fine place," she said softly. Her words were a simple statement, but they held an undercurrent of something more. Gratitude, acceptance. He didn't know. He just knew it made him feel exposed. "It's just a cabin," he mumbled, turning away to busy himself with lighting a fire in the fireplace. The kindling caught, and a small flame danced to life, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The silence returned, this time filled with the crackle of burning wood. It was an awkward, suffocating silence. 2 worlds had collided, and the air was thick with the dust of their meeting. Finally, Sarah spoke. "I will make dinner." Jed stopped what he was doing and stared at her. "Dinner?" he scoffed. "I can take care of myself. I've been doing it for 10 years. My father said you have not been eating well. I will help you." She didn't ask. She simply stated her intention. She began to unpack her satchel, pulling out a small bag of flour, some dried beans, and a tin of salt pork. She was a woman of simple needs and immense practicality. She was a force of nature in her own quiet way. Jed watched her, a knot of frustration tightening in his stomach. He was a man who lived by his own rules, and now this girl was here, bringing her own rules and her own way of life into his world. She didn't see the danger he represented, the darkness that lurked within him. She saw a man who needed help. Her innocence was both a shield and a weapon. He grabbed his hat and stomped out the door. "I'm going hunting," he said, his voice laced with an irritation he couldn't hide. He didn't wait for her to respond. He needed to be alone. He needed the silence of the woods to clear his head, to put a stop to the frantic pounding of his heart. Sarah didn't follow him. She just watched him go, a small, sad expression on her face. She knew he was running, but she also knew, in her quiet, unwavering way, that he could not run forever. The past, like the mountains around them, was a part of him, and it was a part of her now too. The cabin, once a symbol of his isolation, was now a battleground for 2 souls, one wild and untamed, the other pure and disciplined, fighting to find a common ground in a world that had thrown them together. Jed returned to the cabin a few hours later, a hunted deer slung over his shoulder. The sun had set, and the cabin was bathed in the warm, inviting glow of a lantern. The air was filled with the savory scent of stew, a smell so alien to him that for a moment he thought he was dreaming. He stepped inside, and his eyes immediately found Sarah. She was stirring a pot over the fire, her movements fluid and graceful. She was humming a soft, melodic tune, a sound that filled the cavernous space of the cabin. She looked up as he entered. Her eyes, so full of sadness earlier, now held a glint of something akin to warmth. "You are back," she said simply. Jed dropped the deer on the floor with a thud, the sound echoing in the small space. He felt a sudden, irrational anger at the domesticity of the scene. The cabin was no longer his. It was hers. She had, in a matter of hours, transformed it into a home, a place of warmth and life. He felt like an intruder. "I told you I could fend for myself," he grumbled, taking out his knife and beginning to clean the deer. Sarah didn't respond. She just continued to stir the pot, a small knowing smile on her lips. She had known he would return. She had seen the lost look in his eyes, the deep-seated loneliness he tried so hard to hide. They ate in silence, the clinking of spoons against tin bowls the only sound. The stew was delicious, the first real hot meal Jed had in years. It was more than just food. It was a symbol of her care, a gesture of quiet defiance. She was not a possession, not an object to be guarded. She was a woman with a will of her own, and she was here to stay. After dinner, Sarah began to wash the dishes. Jed watched her, mesmerized by her movements. She was so different from the women he had known. She had a quiet strength, a gentle power that unnerved him. Where will you sleep?" Jed finally asked, his voice low. Sarah stopped what she was doing. She looked at the single bed in the corner. "I will sleep on the floor. It is my place to do so." "No," Jed said, his voice firm. He knew the Amish had a strict code of modesty and separation. He wasn't going to force her into a situation that would make her uncomfortable. "You will take the bed. I will sleep on the floor." Sarah shook her head. "This is your home. It is not my place to take your bed." A battle of wills began, a silent, stubborn argument fought with words unspoken. Finally, Jed gave up. He grabbed a few blankets from a trunk, spread them out on the floor by the fire, and lay down. He pulled the blankets up to his chin, his back to her, but his mind was not at rest. He could feel her presence in the room, her soft breathing, the rustle of her dress as she moved. The cabin felt too small, too intimate. He spent the night in a state of hyper-awareness, his senses on high alert. He was a hunter, a man of instinct, and his instincts told him something was wrong. His past, the one he had tried to outrun, was catching up to him. The woman in the bed, the symbol of his father's last wish, was a reminder of all he had lost. His family, his reputation, his heart. He couldn't sleep. He stared at the flickering embers in the fireplace, his mind replaying the last 10 years, the long, lonely years of self-imposed exile. He heard a soft cry in the night, a small, muffled sob. He turned, his heart a hammer in his chest. Sarah was sitting up in bed, her hands covering her face. He saw her shoulders shaking. He wanted to go to her to offer a word of comfort, but he was frozen. He was not a man of comfort. He was a man of the wild, of solitude. He stayed where he was, a silent witness to her pain. He didn't know what to do. The silence, which had been his sanctuary, was now a barrier between them. He had been given a mission, a task he never asked for. He was a guardian, a protector, and he had no idea how to fulfill this duty. The first night in the cabin was a brutal lesson in the fragility of a human heart, and Jed, who had long since forgotten the rhythm of one, felt a strange, terrifying new beat begin to stir in his own chest. The fear of the unknown, of a life no longer solitary, was a cold hand gripping his soul, and for the first time in a decade, Jedediah Stone was afraid. The sun rose on a day that felt different. The air was crisp, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. Jed woke up on the floor, his body stiff, but his mind was clear. He had made it through the night. Sarah was already up, tending to the fire, a soft hum on her lips. She didn't mention the previous night, the quiet sobs, the unspoken pain. She simply offered him a bowl of hot porridge. He took it, the warmth of the bowl seeping into his cold hands. "I need to go to town," he said, his voice flat. Sarah looked up from her work. "Why?" "Supplies," he said, gesturing to the bare shelves. "And I need to see the lawyer. There's more to the will than just you and the cabin." He was referring to his father's detailed instructions about the land, the trap lines, and a small sum of money set aside for Sarah's future. His father had planned for everything, a final act of love and control. Jed walked to the door, pulling on his boots. "I'll be back before nightfall." Sarah nodded, her gaze steady. "Be careful." The words were so simple, so genuine, that Jed stopped. He turned to look at her. He wasn't used to people caring. He was a man who lived on the edge, a man for whom a slip of the foot could mean a broken leg and a slow, agonizing death. Her concern, a fragile thread of human connection, was both alien and deeply moving. He just grunted and walked out the door, a sudden tightness in his chest. He felt like a boy again, like a son who had just been told to be careful by his mother. He hated the feeling, yet he couldn't shake it. The walk to town was different this time. He was not just a man on his own. He was a man with a charge, a responsibility. He was no longer an island. He had a connection, a link to the world he had left behind. He met the lawyer, a stern man with spectacles perched on his nose, who explained the details of his inheritance. The sum of money for Sarah's dowry was held in a trust, to be given to her when she chose to marry or reach the age of 21. Jed's father had been incredibly specific, knowing that his wild son would likely squander it. "And there's the matter of her fiancé," the lawyer said, adjusting his glasses. "A young man named Jacob. He's been asking about her. He's quite persistent. He believes she belongs with him." Jed's jaw tightened. "She's with me now. That was my father's will." The lawyer nodded slowly. "Yes, but it won't stop him from trying to get her back. The Amish community has its own laws, and they do not take kindly to a man of your reputation taking one of their own." Jed's heart pounded. A new enemy. An enemy with a face and a name. He had a whole new set of problems to contend with. He was not just a mountain man anymore. He was a protector, a guardian, and he was being challenged. He bought a few supplies, flour, sugar, salt, and some coffee beans, and started the trek back. His mind was a storm of conflicting emotions. He felt a fierce, protective instinct towards Sarah, an instinct that surprised him. He had spent a decade running from people, from human connection, and now he was willing to fight for it. He was a man of the mountains, a hunter, and he had just found a new and very different kind of prey. As he neared the cabin, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, he saw Sarah sitting on the porch, her hands clasped in her lap. She was waiting for him. Her presence was a beacon of light in the growing darkness. He knew with a certainty that was both terrifying and comforting that his lonely mountain life was over. He was no longer a lone wolf. He had a companion, an ally, a responsibility. He had a home, and a girl who was slowly but surely turning that house into a home. The first glimmer of trust had been ignited, and in the quiet of the evening, Jed Stone, the lonely mountain man, felt the first stirrings of a new kind of purpose. The next few days passed in a quiet, almost domestic rhythm. Jed hunted and trapped, his skills honed by years of survival. Sarah, in her own quiet way, transformed the cabin. She cleaned every corner, polished the wooden floors, and organized the kitchen. She made simple but delicious meals, and the cabin was now filled with the warm, comforting scent of baked bread and simmering stew. The silence that had once defined Jed's life was now filled with the gentle sounds of her movements, the soft hum of her songs, the crackle of the fire. They talked very little. Jed was a man of few words, and Sarah was a woman of quiet contemplation. But they communicated through actions. Jed brought her firewood, and she made sure there was a hot cup of coffee waiting for him. He repaired a loose floorboard, and she mended a tear in his coat. A silent, unspoken truce had been declared, a fragile bridge built between their two worlds. One evening, as Jed was carving a new handle for his axe and Sarah was sewing, they heard the sound of footsteps outside. Jed's head shot up, his hand going instinctively to his rifle, which he kept close by. The sound was not an animal, but a man's purposeful stride. The door creaked open, and a figure stood silhouetted against the setting sun. It was Jacob, Sarah's fiancé. He was a tall, lean man with a determined set to his jaw and a look of barely contained anger in his eyes. He was dressed in the traditional Amish clothing, a plain black suit and a straw hat. He took in the scene before him, the lit lantern, the warm fire, Sarah sewing and Jed carving. The sight of the two of them together, looking so settled, so domestic, fueled the fire in his eyes. "Sarah," he said, his voice hard, "it is time for you to come home." Sarah rose, her face pale. She looked at Jacob, then at Jed. She was caught between two worlds, the one she was born into and the one she had been thrust into. "I am where I am meant to be, Jacob," she said, her voice soft but firm. Jacob scoffed, his eyes flashing with fury. He turned his gaze on Jed, a look of pure contempt on his face. "And who is this man to you? A savage from the mountains? This is not the life for you, Sarah. You are betrothed to me. Our community is waiting for you. This man, he is not one of us. He is not a man of God." Jed slowly rose to his feet, his hand still on the axe handle. His eyes were cold, his body tense. He was a man of the wild, and he was being challenged in his own den. "She is under my care," he said, his voice a low growl. "My father's will." "The will of a worldly man means nothing to us," Jacob spat. "The community has decided. You are a danger to her. You will let her go, or there will be trouble." Jed took a step forward, his body coiled with a primal rage. The words of the lawyer echoed in his mind. The Amish community has its own laws. He had a choice to make. He could hand her over and go back to his solitary life, or he could fight for her. He looked at Sarah. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, but also a deep-seated resolve. She was not a possession to be handed over. She was a person, a choice to be made. "She is not going anywhere with you," Jed said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You will leave now." Jacob's face flushed with anger. "You will regret this, Jedediah Stone. You have no idea who you are dealing with." He turned on his heel and stormed out of the cabin, the sound of his footsteps a testament to his fury. The silence that followed was heavy and thick with unsaid words. Sarah stood frozen, her hands clasped tightly together. Jed, his fist still clenched, watched the door, his mind already calculating the possible dangers. He had been a man of solitude, and now he was a man with an enemy. He had been a man with nothing to lose, and now he had something to protect. He looked at Sarah, the soft glow of the lantern casting a gentle light on her face. Her eyes met his, and he saw for the first time not fear, but a flicker of gratitude. She had stood with him, not against him. In that moment, a bond, fragile and new, was forged between the two of them. The mountains, which had been his only solace, now felt like a fortress he was ready to defend. The morning after Jacob's visit was shrouded in a thick fog, mirroring the uncertainty that now hung in the air. Jed woke with a sense of foreboding. Jacob's threat was not an idle one. The Amish were a close-knit community, and he had now become an outsider's enemy. He knew he couldn't stay in the cabin and wait for trouble to come. He needed to understand what he was up against. He told Sarah he was going to town to get more supplies. She nodded, a quiet understanding in her eyes. "Be careful," she said again, the words carrying more weight than they had before. This time, the trek to town was purposeful, not aimless. He needed information. He went to the old general store, a place where news traveled faster than a telegram. The proprietor, a grizzled old man named Silas, was a fount of local gossip. Jed bought a few things, then leaned against the counter, his voice low. "Silas, you know the Miller family, the Amish folks?" Silas looked up from his work, his eyes narrowing. "I know 'em. Good people. A shame about what happened to the girl." "What happened?" Jed asked, a knot forming in his stomach. Silas leaned in, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Word is, Sarah was betrothed to that Jacob fella. Good, respectable man. But their wedding was postponed. Something to do with her mother's illness. They say she was suffering from a fever, a sickness that came out of nowhere. Sarah was caring for her, and then her mother passed. It was a tragedy. But a week later, Sarah's father sends her away to your father. Jed's mind raced. Something was wrong with this story. The timeline didn't add up. Why would Sarah's father send her to a virtual stranger in the mountains after her mother's death? It didn't make sense. And Jacob, Jed pushed. He seems angry. Silas let out a dry, humorless chuckle. Angry? He's furious. He was promised a wife and now she's gone. His family's pressuring him. The Amish, they don't like it when things don't go according to plan. They're a proud lot. They see this as an insult. The word is the Millers and your father, they had a falling out years ago. Something about a business deal gone wrong. But then Jed's father helped them when they were in a bind, and a friendship was rekindled. A strange one, but a friendship nonetheless. But that Jacob, he's a mean one. He's been stirring up trouble. Jed felt a fresh wave of unease. This wasn't just about a woman and a man. It was about pride, community, and an old feud that had been buried, but not forgotten. He had been pulled into a conflict he knew nothing about, a pawn in a game of revenge and honor. He left the store, his mind buzzing. He needed to talk to Sarah. He had been so caught up in his own survival, his own anger and confusion, that he hadn't thought to ask her about her past. He had treated her like a symbol, not a person with her own story, her own pain. He hurried back to the cabin, the fog now beginning to lift, revealing the raw, beautiful landscape. When he reached the cabin, he found Sarah tending to the small garden. She looked up, her expression a mix of relief and concern. "I'm glad you are back," she said softly. Jed sat down on the porch step. "Sarah," he began, his voice uncharacteristically gentle, "we need to talk. About Jacob. About your family. I heard some things in town." Sarah's face went pale. She sat down next to him, her hands clasped tightly. She had been waiting for this moment, waiting for him to ask. The secrets of her past had been a heavy burden, and she was ready to share them. The truth, like the fog, was about to lift. Jed was a man of the mountains, a man of brutal honesty, and he was about to discover the truth behind the promise that had brought him back to the world of men, a truth that would change everything. Sarah took a deep breath, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "My mother. She was not well. She had a fever that would not break. We tried everything. The community elders said it was a test of faith. We prayed. We waited, but she did not get better." Jed listened, his expression grim. He knew about illness, about the unforgiving nature of the wild. "My father, he was desperate," Sarah continued, her voice trembling slightly. "He had a small sum of money, an inheritance. He knew of a doctor in town, a worldly man, but a good one. He was willing to risk excommunication from our church to save my mother. He told no one. We left in the middle of the night, but we were seen by Jacob. He followed us. He was furious. He said my father was a sinner, a man who had strayed from the path of God. He said he would tell the elders. My father. He was afraid." Jed's hands tightened into fists. He was beginning to understand. This wasn't just a feud. This was about power, control, and a secret that could tear a family apart. "The doctor said my mother had a bad fever," Sarah went on, her voice a fragile whisper. "He gave her medicine, but it was too late. She passed away a few days later. My father was devastated. And then Jacob, he used it against us. He said my father's worldly actions were a sin, and that my mother's death was a punishment from God. He told the elders. My father was shamed. He was no longer a respected member of the community. And Jacob, he told my father that if I did not go to him and marry him, he would reveal the rest of the story to the community." Jed's blood ran cold. The rest of the story. "My father owed your father a debt," Sarah explained, her eyes meeting Jed's. "Years ago, your father, a man he called a friend, helped my family when we were in need. My father promised to repay him in any way he could. When my mother passed and my father was in a state of despair, he wrote to your father. He explained our situation. He was afraid of Jacob. He was afraid for me. He was afraid of the shame that would befall my family. Your father, in his final letter, said that he would keep the secret of my mother's death and my father's actions, but only if I, in return, would go and live with you. He said you were a good man at heart, a man who needed to be saved, a man who was lost. My father, in his desperation, agreed. It was a choice between two evils. He gave me to you to protect me from Jacob's wrath. The weight of the secret settled on Jed's shoulders. He was not just a guardian, he was an accomplice. His father had made a deal with the devil to save a friend, and in doing so, had bound his son to a woman who was a pawn in a game of religious zealotry and family honor. So, the will, Jed said, his voice flat. It was a lie. Not a lie, Sarah corrected softly. A promise. A desperate promise made by two fathers who were trying to do what was best for their children. It was a last resort. My father believed that with you, I would be safe from Jacob. And your father believed that with me, you would be saved from yourself. Jed was silent for a long time, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. His father had not just left him a cabin. He had left him a life, a purpose, a reason to live. He had entrusted him with the most precious thing he could, the life of an innocent young woman, a woman who had given up everything to keep a secret that had now been revealed. The fog of the past had finally lifted, and the truth, raw and painful, was laid bare. He looked at Sarah, her face bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, and he saw a different person, not just an Amish girl, but a woman of immense strength, a woman who had shouldered a burden far too heavy for her years. He saw in her eyes a glimmer of the same loneliness he had felt for a decade. He was not alone in this fight. He had an ally, a companion, and he knew with a certainty that was as unshakable as the mountains themselves that he would do whatever it took to keep her safe. The truth had changed everything. The unspoken tension between them was gone, replaced by a quiet, fierce resolve. They were no longer strangers thrown together by a twist of fate. They were two souls bound by a shared secret, united against a common enemy. Jed spent the morning chopping wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a soothing balm to his turbulent mind. He was a man of action, and now he had a clear purpose. He needed to fortify the cabin, make it a fortress against the world. He was no longer just a man living in the woods. He was a sentinel, a protector. Sarah, in her own way, was also preparing for a fight. She tended to the garden, a quiet act of defiance against a world that had tried to control her. She was not a damsel in distress. She was a survivor. She was a woman who had endured pain and loss and had come out of it with a strength that was both gentle and unwavering. Just as the sun reached its zenith, a sound broke the peaceful rhythm of their day. The sound of a carriage, the distant rumble of a horse-drawn buggy. Jed froze, his axe held mid-swing. He knew that sound. It was the sound of the Amish community, of men on a mission. He looked at Sarah, who had stopped her work, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and resignation. "They are coming," she whispered. Jed dropped his axe and strode to the cabin, grabbing his rifle. "Get inside," he commanded, his voice a low growl, "and stay away from the window." Sarah did as she was told, her movements quick and efficient. She was not a warrior, but she was brave. Jed stood on the porch, his rifle held loosely in his hands, his body a study in stillness. He was a statue carved from wood and stone, a man who had been alone for so long that he had become a part of the landscape. The buggy pulled into the clearing, kicking up a cloud of dust. 3 men sat inside. Jacob was at the reins, his face a mask of self-righteous fury. Beside him were 2 older men, their faces etched with disapproval and cold judgment. They were the elders, the leaders of the community, men of faith and unwavering conviction. Jacob brought the buggy to a halt. The silence was deafening, a prelude to the storm. Jacob was the first to speak, his voice sharp and full of authority. "Jedediah Stone, we have come for Sarah. The community has decided. She must return with us. This is the will of God." Jed raised his rifle, the metal glinting in the sunlight. "She is not going with you. This is my father's will, and it will be honored. She is safe here." The elders exchanged a glance. One of them, a man with a long white beard and a look of deep sorrow in his eyes, spoke, "This is not about the will of a worldly man. This is about the law of our people. This is about a soul who has strayed from the path. This is about a promise that must be kept." "The promise was broken when you threatened her family," Jed said, his voice flat and unforgiving. He was a man of the mountains, and he knew a trap when he saw one. He was not going to be pulled into a theological debate. This was a battle for a human soul, and he was ready to fight. "You know nothing of our ways," Jacob spat, his hand on the reins, ready to bolt. "You are a sinner, a man of violence. You are no match for the will of our community." "I am a man who keeps his promises," Jed countered, his eyes fixed on Jacob, "and I promised to keep her safe. Now you will leave, and you will not come back. The next time, my aim will not be so high." The threat was clear. The elders looked at Jed, their faces a mixture of fear and surprise. This was not the man they had expected. He was not a wild, unthinking beast. He was a man with a purpose, a man who was ready to die for it. Jacob, seeing the determination in Jed's eyes and the lack of support from his companions, turned the buggy around. The two elders looked back at Jed, a flicker of something akin to respect in their eyes. They had come to retrieve a stray sheep, but they had found a lion protecting his den. The buggy rumbled away, a cloud of dust the only testament to their visit. Jed lowered his rifle, his body still tense, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He had stood his ground. He had faced his enemy and sent him away. He looked at the cabin, his home, his fortress. He looked at Sarah, who was now standing in the doorway, her face pale, but her eyes filled with a new kind of light. She had been a lost soul, a lamb in a world of wolves, but she had found her protector, and he had found his purpose. The first showdown was over, but they both knew with a chilling certainty that it was only the beginning. The war for a soul had just begun, and the lonely mountain man was ready to fight. The day after the showdown with Jacob and the elders felt strangely peaceful. A fragile calm had settled over the cabin, a silence no longer filled with the weight of unspoken secrets, but with the quiet understanding that comes from facing a common enemy. Jed and Sarah moved with a new synchronicity, their actions speaking louder than any words could. Jed continued his work, felling trees and splitting logs with a newfound purpose. His movements were precise, powerful. He was building a wall, a physical barrier against the world that was trying to claim Sarah. Sarah, in turn, worked in the garden, her fingers moving deftly through the soil. Planting seeds of hope in a land that had once been barren, they ate their meals in a quiet companionship, the tension of the past replaced by a comfortable rhythm. Jed found himself watching her more often, noticing the way the sunlight caught the strands of her hair under her white cap, the quiet strength in her hands as she kneaded dough. He saw her not as a burden, not as an obligation, but as a person he had chosen to protect. His father's will had been a cold legal document, but Jed's choice was one of the heart. That evening, as the stars began to pepper the darkening sky, a fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow across the cabin. Sarah sat on a small stool, mending one of Jed's torn shirts, her head bowed in concentration. Jed sat across from her, sharpening his hunting knife. The silence was not empty. It was full of the quiet sounds of their lives, the soft scrape of the whetstone, the gentle snip of scissors, the quiet snap of the fire. Jed finally broke the silence, his voice a low rumble. "You were brave yesterday. You stood your ground." Sarah looked up, a soft smile on her lips. "I was afraid, but I knew you would not let them take me." Her faith in him was a heavy weight, a responsibility he had never asked for, but was now determined to honor. "They won't be back for a while," Jed said, his voice firm, "but they will be back. They are not men who give up." Sarah nodded, her expression serious. "I know. They see me as a test of their faith. If they can bring me back, it is a victory for their beliefs." Jed's jaw tightened. He had been a man of instinct, a man of simple needs and brutal truths. The world of faith and honor was alien to him, but he knew this much. He would not let them win. He would not let them take her. He looked at Sarah, a sudden urge to know more about her past, her life before the fever and the secret. "What was it like?" he asked. "Before all this? Your life? In the community?" Sarah's eyes grew distant, a sad, nostalgic look on her face. "It was simple. We woke with the sun, worked in the fields. We spent our days in prayer and in work. There was a rhythm to it, a sense of belonging. Everyone knew their place. There were no secrets. Not like here." She paused, her eyes meeting his. "Not like with us." Jed flinched. The word secrets was a reminder of the ugly truth that had brought them together. "I don't have secrets anymore," Jed said, his voice flat. "The ones I had are gone." He was referring to his own past, the one he had tried to bury in the mountains. The past that had made him the lonely mountain man. The past that his father's will had dragged to the surface. He felt an urge to tell her, to confess the sins that had driven him to this life. But the words wouldn't come. The shame was a physical thing, a rock in his gut. Sarah, sensing his struggle, reached out and gently laid her hand on his arm. Her touch was warm, soft, and so very real. "Everyone has a past, Jedediah," she said softly. "It is what we do now that matters." Her words were a balm to his soul, a quiet forgiveness he didn't know he needed. In that moment, the unspoken bond between them solidified. They were two broken souls, brought together by an impossible will, and in each other they were beginning to find a path to healing. The silent threat of Jacob and the community loomed in the distance, but for now, in the quiet warmth of the cabin, the only thing that mattered was the fragile peace they had found. The next day Jed set out on a long patrol. He walked the perimeter of his property, his eyes scanning for signs of trespassers, his senses on high alert. The threat of Jacob and the community was not just a passing one. It was a tangible danger. He saw no signs of them, but he did see something else. Tracks. They were not fresh, a few days old, but they were there. A small, subtle sign that he was being watched. His mind, once a blank canvas, was now filled with purpose. He was no longer just a man surviving. He was a guardian, a protector. His solitary life was over. He had a reason to fight, a reason to live. As he walked, his mind drifted back to the past, the memories he had tried so hard to bury. He remembered the fire, the smell of smoke and burning wood. He remembered the screams of the villagers as the flames consumed their homes. He remembered his father, a respected blacksmith who had been accused of starting the fire, of being a saboteur. The accusation had been a lie, a rival's way of getting rid of the competition. But the villagers, blinded by fear and anger, had believed it. They had ostracized his family, destroyed their livelihood, and his father, a proud man, had been broken by the shame. Jed, a young man then, had fought back. He had tried to prove his father's innocence. He had confronted the accusers, had been beaten and left for dead. He had seen the hatred in their eyes, the irrational anger. The world of men was a brutal, unforgiving place, and he had fled. He had chosen the mountains, the cold, silent world of the wild, over the betrayal and cruelty of humanity. He came back to the cabin, his heart heavy with the weight of the past. Sarah was inside, her face soft in the glow of the lantern. She saw the look on his face, the deep-seated sadness that he tried so hard to hide. "You look troubled," she said, her voice soft. Jed hesitated. He had never told anyone, not about the fire, not about the shame, not about the hatred. But he felt a need to tell her, a need to share the truth. He was no longer alone in this fight, and the burden of the past was too heavy to carry on his own. He sat down across from her, the firelight dancing in his eyes. I did not come to these mountains because I loved them. I came here to run, to hide." He told her the story, the fire, the accusation, the hatred, the shame. He told her about the world he had left behind, a world that had betrayed him. He told her about his father, a good man broken by lies. He told her about the rage and the pain that had driven him to this life. Sarah listened without interruption, her eyes fixed on his. She didn't judge him. She didn't offer empty words of comfort. She simply listened, her presence a silent, unwavering support. When he was done, he looked away, his face a mask of shame and grief. "You see," he said, his voice a low rasp, "I am not a good man. I am a man of shame and anger. A man who runs from his past." Sarah reached out and took his hand, her touch gentle but firm. "No," she said, her voice filled with a quiet certainty. "You are a man who has been hurt, a man who was broken by the cruelty of others. But you did not turn bitter. You are a man who stood your ground yesterday. You are a man who has chosen to protect an innocent. Your past does not define you, Jedediah. Your heart does." Her words were a quiet absolution, a grace he didn't know he deserved. She saw past the scars, past the ragged clothes and the matted beard to the man inside. She saw the truth of his heart. The unspoken bond between them grew stronger, forged in the crucible of shared pain and honest revelation. They were not just a mountain man and an Amish girl. They were two broken souls, pieces of a puzzle, finding their way back to wholeness. The scars of the past would always be a part of them, but they were no longer a barrier. They were a reminder of how far they had come, and a testament to the strength they had found in each other. The truth had brought them closer. With the secrets of their past laid bare, a new level of trust had formed between them. It was a silent, unshakable trust. Jed, who had spent a decade relying only on himself, found himself listening to Sarah's quiet wisdom. And Sarah, who had lived a life of rigid rules and a communal order, found herself leaning on Jed's strength, his raw and unwavering presence. One morning, as Jed was preparing to go hunting, Sarah stopped him. "Jedediah," she said, her voice soft, "the garden needs tending. The weeds are choking the new sprouts. If we don't clear them, we will have no food in the winter." Jed looked at her, then at the garden. It was a small, wild patch of land, but he knew she was right. His father had planted it, a small act of hope. Jed, in his years of exile, had simply let it go. He was a hunter, a man of the wild. He didn't tend to gardens. "I can hunt," he said, his voice gruff. "That's how I survive." "And what happens when the snows come?" Sarah asked, her eyes gentle but firm. "When the animals go into hiding, we will have nothing but dried meat. We need a store of food for the winter. This is a time for tending, not for just taking." Her words were a quiet rebuke, a lesson in a different way of life. The wild was about taking what you needed, about survival. The land, she was teaching him, was about partnership, about a careful dance of giving and receiving. Jed, for the first time, put down his rifle. He picked up a hoe instead, a foreign object in his calloused hands. He walked to the garden, the early morning sun warming his back. Sarah joined him, and together they began to work. She taught him which plants were weeds and which were sprouts. She showed him how to gently pull the weeds from the soil, how to tend to the fragile new life. He was clumsy at first, his large hands used to the weight of an axe or a rifle, but he was a man of the wild, a man of observation. He learned quickly. They worked side by side, their movements in a new, quiet rhythm. There was no need for words. They were a team. He saw the satisfaction on her face as she cleared a patch of weeds, the quiet pride in her eyes as she looked at the newly tilled soil. It was not a grand gesture of heroism, not a dramatic confrontation with an enemy. It was a simple, quiet act of faith, a belief that if you tend to the land, it will provide for you. As they worked, Jed felt something shift inside of him. The anger and the rage that had been a part of him for so long began to recede, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. He was no longer just a man running from his past. He was a man building a future. The garden was a symbol of that future, a tangible representation of the life they were creating together. That evening, they sat on the porch, tired but content. The garden, though still small, was neat and orderly. The promise of food was a quiet, comforting presence. "It is a good start," Sarah said, her voice filled with a quiet satisfaction. Jed nodded. He looked at his hands caked with dirt, a stark contrast to his usual calloused and clean hands. He saw not a man of the wild, but a man of the land. He was learning to live again, not just to survive. The lesson had been a simple one, a lesson in trust and tending. He had trusted her wisdom, and in return he had found a piece of himself he thought was lost forever. He was a man of the mountains, a man of the wild, but he was also a man of the land, a man who was learning to build, to grow, and to hope. The weight of his past was still there, but it was no longer a burden. It was a foundation, and on that foundation he and Sarah were building a life. The fragile peace that had settled over the cabin was shattered by a new and more insidious threat. The confrontation with Jacob had been a test of will. This was a direct attack on their livelihood. Jed woke one morning to the telltale signs of a sabotaged trapline. The snares were sprung, the bait gone, and a clear message left for him. A small wooden cross, a symbol of the Amish faith, driven into the earth near his camp. It was a clear sign from Jacob. He was not just a spurned lover, he was a man of vengeance. Jed's blood ran cold. This was not a physical threat. It was a psychological one, a threat to his livelihood, to his ability to provide, a threat to their very survival. He looked at the cross, the simple hand-carved piece of wood, and he felt a surge of rage. He was not just fighting for Sarah's freedom, he was fighting for his own. He returned to the cabin, his face a grim mask. He didn't say anything to Sarah at first. He didn't want to worry her, but she saw the look in his eyes, the deep-seated anger that had returned. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the coiled readiness of his body. "What is it, Jedediah?" she asked, her voice soft with concern. "What happened?" Jed couldn't hide it. He couldn't lie to her. He was no longer a man of secrets. "My trapline," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "They've been here. They're trying to starve us out." He pulled the cross from his pocket, the symbol of a peaceful faith now a weapon in a brutal war. Sarah's face paled when she saw it. "Jacob," she whispered, her eyes filled with a fresh wave of fear. "He is relentless." "He's a coward," Jed growled. "He won't fight me man to man. He'll just try to break us from the inside out." He was right. The attacks continued. A broken fence here, a missing tool there, small petty acts of sabotage designed to wear them down, to break their spirit. It was a war of attrition, and Jed, a man used to fighting with his fists and his rifle, was now forced to fight a ghost. The emotional toll began to show. Jed grew more and more withdrawn, the anger a constant, low-burning fire in his gut. He was a man of action, and he was being forced into a passive, defensive position. He was a hunter, and he was being hunted. He was a mountain man, and he was being starved out of his own home. Sarah saw his frustration, his despair. She saw the rage return to his eyes. She saw the man who had been healing, the man who had been tending to the garden, begin to retreat back into the shell of the lonely mountain man. One evening, after another day of finding a ruined trap, Jed was silent. He sat by the fire, his face a mask of bitter defeat. He had tried everything. He had set new traps, had watched the trails, but Jacob was a ghost, a phantom in the woods. Sarah, her heart aching for him, went to him. She knelt by his side, her hand resting on his arm. "Jedediah," she said softly, "you are not alone in this." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a raw, desperate pain. "I am not a man who can be broken," he said, his voice a low, fierce whisper. "I have fought and survived worse than this, but he is a coward. He won't face me." "He is not a coward," Sarah said, her voice firm. "He is a man who believes he is right. He believes he is doing the work of God. That is a dangerous man, a man who will stop at nothing." Her words were a sobering realization. This was not just a personal vendetta. This was a holy war, and Jed was in the middle of it. The echoes of a broken promise, the promise made by his father, were now a full-blown attack on their lives. Jed, the man who had tried to outrun his past, was now facing a future that was more dangerous, more complicated, and more personal than he could have ever imagined. The cold, relentless war had just begun. The small acts of sabotage escalated into something more serious. Jed's hunting rifle was found bent and unusable. His meager food stores were ruined, and a small but vital part of the cabin was set on fire. The fire was quickly extinguished, But the message was clear. They were being targeted, not just for their possessions, but for their lives. The constant tension, the relentless attacks, had a profound effect on Jed. He was a man of the wild, a hunter, a survivor. He was used to physical threats, to fighting against the elements, against hungry animals. But this was different. This was a war of the mind, a battle against a ghost. It was wearing him down. He was no longer sleeping well, his mind constantly on high alert, his body a bundle of nervous energy. He was a raw nerve, a man on the edge. Sarah, in her quiet, steadfast way, was his rock. She didn't panic, she didn't scream, she simply worked, her hands a constant testament to her faith. She mended what could be mended, she rationed what they had, and she kept their spirits up with her quiet strength. She saw the man he was becoming, the angry, resentful man who had fled the world, and she was determined to pull him back. One evening, as a storm raged outside, the rain lashing against the windows and the wind howling like a banshee, Jed was a coiled spring. He sat by the fire, his rifle in his lap, his eyes fixed on the door. He was waiting. He knew Jacob would not attack in a storm. He was a man of faith, not a fool. But Jed's mind was a whirlwind of paranoia and rage. "Jedediah," Sarah said softly, "you must rest. You have not slept in days." Jed didn't answer. His eyes were wide, staring into the darkness. He saw shadows where there were none. He heard footsteps where there was only the wind. He was losing his mind. The rage was consuming him, turning him into the very savage Jacob claimed he was. Sarah, seeing the haunted look in his eyes, did something she had never done before. She went to him and took his face in her hands. Her touch was warm, soft, and so very real. "Jedediah," she said, her voice filled with a quiet strength. "Look at me." Jed's gaze, wild and unfocused, slowly met hers. He saw no judgment, no fear, only a deep, unwavering love. A love he didn't know he needed. "This is what Jacob wants," she said, her voice a low whisper. "He wants to break you. He wants to turn you back into the man you were before, the man who lived in the cold and the darkness. Don't let him win." Jed's breath hitched. He had been so focused on fighting Jacob that he had forgotten what he was fighting for. He was fighting for a future, for a life with Sarah, a life of peace and a quiet rhythm. He was fighting for himself. He leaned into her touch, a broken man coming home. The tension in his body slowly began to melt away. The rage in his gut began to recede. He was not alone in this. He had her. She was his anchor, his North Star in a storm. Suddenly a loud bang from the side of the cabin startled them both. A rock, wrapped in a note, had been thrown through the small window, shattering the glass and scattering shards on the floor. Jed, his heart a hammer in his chest, rose to his feet, his rifle held tight. He unwrapped the note. His eyes scanned the familiar, spidery handwriting of his father, but it wasn't his father's writing. It was a crude imitation, and the message was a chilling one. "You have taken what is mine. Soon I will come for her and take her back, even if I have to burn this cabin to the ground." Jed's hands trembled. It was a direct threat, a promise of violence. Jacob was done with the petty attacks. He was ready for a war. He had used his father's past, the fire, the shame, as a weapon against him. He was not just attacking their livelihood, he was attacking the very foundation of their bond. He was a ghost from his past, haunting his present. And Jed knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that the war for a soul had just become a battle for their lives. The morning after the attack was different. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky of brilliant blue. But the peace was an illusion. The threat from Jacob was no longer a ghost. It was a tangible presence, a promise of violence that hung in the air like a thick fog. Jed was not a man to be intimidated by a threat. He was a man of action. He knew what he had to do. He had to prepare for a fight. He spent the morning boarding up the shattered window, reinforcing the doors, and setting up traps around the perimeter of the cabin. His movements were purposeful, deliberate. He was no longer just a man surviving. He was a man preparing for a war. Sarah, in her quiet, unwavering way, worked alongside him, her hands gentle but firm. She held the nails, she handed him the hammer, and she brought him food and water. She was not a warrior, but she was a partner. She was a woman who had given up her life to protect a secret, and she was not about to let a man who claimed to be a man of God ruin the new life she was building. As they worked, Jed's mind was a whirlwind of rage and frustration. He was a man of the wild, and he was being forced to defend his home. He had fled from a world of violence and betrayal, and that world had found him again. The bitterness was a physical presence in his gut. That evening, as they sat by the fire, the cabin a small fortified island in a sea of darkness, Jed's rage finally boiled over. "I should have known," he said, his voice a low growl. "He's just like the others. He uses God's name to justify his hatred. He's a coward, and he will not win." Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with a deep, abiding sadness. "Hatred is a heavy burden, Jedediah," she said softly. "Do not let him make you into what he wants you to be. He wants you to be a man of rage, a man of violence. He wants to prove his story right." Jed scoffed, a bitter, humorless laugh. "What else am I supposed to do? Wait for him to burn us out? He's a ghost. He can come at any time, in any way." "He is not a ghost," a voice said from the shadows near the door. Jed and Sarah's heads shot up. A figure stepped into the light, an old, wizened man with a face as wrinkled as a dried apple. He was dressed in a simple dark suit, and his eyes, a clear, piercing blue, were filled with a quiet intelligence. "Who are you?" Jed demanded, his hand going to the rifle beside him. "My name is Levi," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "I am a friend of your father, and an elder of the Amish community." Jed's mind reeled. An elder? Here? Now? After all the threats and all the sabotage, an elder had come to their door. "Jacob is not a man of God," Levi said, his eyes meeting Jed's. "He is a man of pride and vengeance. He used your father's will as a way to get what he wanted. He wanted to shame Sarah's father, to break him, to get his family back in line. He believed he was doing the right thing, but he was wrong. And you've come to what? To talk me out of this?" Jed scoffed, his voice filled with cynicism. "No," Levi said, a small, sad smile on his lips. "I have come to help you. The community is not of one mind. There are some who believe that Jacob has gone too far. They believe that Sarah should be free to choose her own life. I am here to offer you my help. I am a witness to the truth. I know about the deal that was made between your father and Sarah's father. I know about the secret, and I am willing to testify." Jed stared at the man, a wave of disbelief washing over him. An ally, from the very community that was trying to destroy him. It was too good to be true. He was a man of the wild, a man who trusted no one. But he looked at Sarah, who was watching the old man, her eyes filled with a cautious hope. She believed him. She had a heart that was open to trust, to faith. "Why?" Jed asked, his voice low. "Why help us?" Levi looked at him, his gaze steady. "Because I believe in a God of grace, not a God of vengeance. I believe that love and compassion are more powerful than hatred and pride. And I believe that you, Jedediah, are a good man. Your father believed it, and so do I." Jed felt a lump form in his throat. The words were a quiet absolution, a grace he didn't know he deserved. He was not alone in this fight. He had an unseen ally, a ghost from the past who had returned to set things right. The battle was not just for their lives, it was for their future. And with a new ally by his side, Jed knew that the fight was just beginning. The presence of Levi, the Amish elder, was a game-changer. He was an unseen ally, a man of faith and wisdom who had risked everything to help them. He did not stay in the cabin. His presence would only incite more trouble. But he came every few days, bringing with him news from the community and offering quiet, sage advice. He told them that Jacob's actions were being noticed and that many in the community were growing concerned. Jacob's crusade against Sarah and Jed was beginning to be seen not as a holy mission, but as an act of petty vengeance. But Levi also warned them. "Jacob is a desperate man," he said, his voice low. "He will not give up. He will try something to get Sarah back. He will try to make you look like a monster, Jedediah. He will try to prove his story right." Jed, a man of the wild, knew that a desperate man was a dangerous man. He knew that the attacks would escalate. The threat was no longer a ghost. It was a hungry wolf, waiting for the right moment to strike. He had to be ready. He had to set a trap of his own. He spent the next few days preparing, his mind sharp and focused. He knew Jacob's tactics. Small, petty acts of sabotage. He would not confront them head-on, not at first. He would try to starve them out, to wear them down. Jed decided to use that to his advantage. He would set a trap, a lure that would bring Jacob out into the open. He spent an entire day creating a false food cache, a small but tempting pile of dried meat and salted fish, left just off the main trail, as if Jed had been in a hurry and had left it. It was a risky move. If Jacob was not the one watching, it would simply be an act of charity to a hungry animal. But Jed, a man of the wild, knew his prey. He knew Jacob's pride, his need to control, his need to prove his own righteousness. That night, Jed and Sarah sat in the cabin, the tension thick in the air. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow on their faces, but their eyes were fixed on the door. They were waiting. They knew that if Jacob took the bait, a confrontation was inevitable. Sarah's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her face pale. "I am afraid," she whispered. Jed went to her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "I know," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But this is our fight now, and we will not be broken." He had been a man who ran from his past, a man who had chosen to be alone. But now, in the quiet of the night, with a fragile woman by his side, he was ready to face his demons and to fight for a future he never thought he would have. Hours passed. The moon rose and set, casting long silvery shadows across the clearing. Just as dawn was beginning to break, they heard it. The soft snap of a twig, the quiet crunch of a footstep. Jed's senses were on high alert. He moved to the window, his body a coiled spring, his rifle held tight. He saw him. Jacob. He was not alone. He had brought 2 other men with him, younger, stronger men from the community. They were carrying lanterns, their faces grim and determined. They were coming for the food cache. They were walking into Jed's trap. Jed's heart pounded in his chest. This was it, the moment of truth. He looked at Sarah, her face a mask of silent prayer. He had a choice to make. He could let them take the bait and run them off, or he could confront them face to face and end this once and for all. He looked at Sarah, at the hope in her eyes, and he knew what he had to do. He would not be a man of petty violence. He would be a man of honor. He would end this now. Jed left the cabin with his rifle and a deep-seated resolve. He was a man of the mountains, a hunter, and he was about to face his prey. He knew the woods like the back of his hand. He moved silently through the trees, his feet making no sound on the damp earth. He came upon them just as they were approaching the food cache. Jacob, his face grim and determined, and his 2 companions, younger men who seemed more hesitant and unsure. Jed stepped out from behind a large pine tree, his rifle held loosely but ready. "Jacob," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. The 3 men froze, their faces a mask of shock and fear. They had expected an animal, a beast to run off with their prize. They had not expected the lonely mountain man, a man who was more than just a man. He was a force of nature, a sentinel. Jacob, recovering from his shock, stepped forward, his jaw set in a defiant line. "You are trespassing on my land," he said, his voice trembling slightly. Jed let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "Your land? You think you can starve me out of my own home? You're a fool, Jacob. A man of God would not do this. You're a man of vengeance." The 2 young men looked at each other, their faces filled with unease. They had been told they were doing the work of God. They had not expected this raw, brutal confrontation. "She is betrothed to me," Jacob said, his voice laced with venom. "She belongs with me. She belongs with her community. She does not belong with a savage like you." "She is her own person," Jed said, his voice a cold, hard stone. "She belongs with no one. She is a woman of her own mind, and she has chosen to be here, with me." He looked at the 2 young men. "You are being used," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "You have been lied to. This is not about faith. This is about a man's pride. a man's need for control, a man who would ruin a family's reputation to get what he wants. The young men looked at Jacob, their faces filled with confusion and doubt. The truth was a physical presence, a palpable weight in the air. Jacob, seeing his control slipping, lunged forward, a small sharp knife in his hand. He was a man of desperate measures, a man who had nothing left to lose. Jed was ready. He moved with the swift, fluid grace of a hunter. He sidestepped Jacob's attack, his hand coming down on Jacob's wrist with a sickening thud. The knife clattered to the ground. Jed twisted Jacob's arm behind his back, a silent, powerful show of strength. "You will not win," Jed whispered in his ear, his voice a low hiss. "You will not win this war. You will go back to your community and you will tell them the truth. You will tell them about the deal, about the secret, about the lies, and you will tell them that if you ever return, I will not be so forgiving." Jed released Jacob's arm, the man falling to the ground in a heap, his face pale with fear and pain. The two young men, seeing their leader defeated, looked at Jed with a new, sober respect. They had been told he was a savage. They had found a man of honor. Jed stood over Jacob, his rifle held in his hands. "Go," he said, his voice a command, "and do not return. The next time, my vengeance will be as swift as the wind." The three men stumbled away, their mission a failure, their pride a broken thing. Jed watched them go, his heart pounding in his chest. The weight of vengeance was a heavy burden, a physical and emotional weight. He was not proud of what he had done. He was not a man of violence. But he had protected what was his home, his life, his Sarah. He walked back to the cabin, the sun rising over the mountains. The war was not over, but the first battle had been won. He had faced his demons, he had protected his family, and he had finally stepped out of the shadow of his past. The lonely mountain man was no longer a ghost. He was a man, a protector, a guardian, and he was finally, truly, home. The days following the confrontation with Jacob were filled with a quiet, profound peace. The threat was gone, for now. Jacob, humiliated and defeated, had not returned. The young men who had witnessed the showdown had returned to their community, their stories surely filled with the raw, brutal honesty of what they had seen. The tide, Jed knew, was beginning to turn. He and Sarah returned to their peaceful rhythm, a rhythm that was now filled with a new level of trust and intimacy. Jed went hunting, but this time he was not just hunting for survival. He was hunting to provide. He brought back not just meat, but a newfound sense of purpose. Sarah, in turn, tended to the garden, a small plot of land that was beginning to blossom with new life. One afternoon, as Jed was repairing a loose shingle on the cabin roof, he saw a lone figure approaching on the path. It was Levi, the Amish elder. He was a man of peace, a man who had risked everything to help them. Jed climbed down from the roof, his heart filled with a quiet gratitude. "Levi," he said, his voice filled with respect, "you have heard?" Levi nodded, a small, knowing smile on his face. "The story has spread like wildfire," he said. "The young men, they told the truth. They told the community about Jacob's lies, about his pride, about his anger. They spoke of your strength, Jedediah, your honor. The community is divided. There are some who still believe that Sarah should be returned to them, but there are more who believe that she is where she is meant to be. With you." Jed felt a lump form in his throat. The community he had fled, the world that had betrayed him, was now a source of hope, a source of peace. "Jacob has been sanctioned," Levi said, his voice low. "He is no longer an elder. He has been shamed. His lies have been exposed. He has nothing left. His vengeance, it has consumed him." Jed felt a small pang of pity. He knew what it was like to be consumed by vengeance. He had been a man of rage, a man of anger. But he had found a way back. Jacob, it seemed, was lost. Levi reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. "This is from Sarah's father," he said, his eyes filled with a quiet joy. "He has heard the truth. He has been told of your honor. He has given his blessing. He knows that his daughter is safe with you, and he wishes you both a life of peace and love." Jed's hands trembled as he took the note. It was a formal, simple thing, but it was filled with the weight of a father's love, a father's forgiveness. The last vestige of the promise, the burden that had brought them together, was gone. The contract was fulfilled. They were free. Jed looked at the cabin, his home, a place that was no longer just a shelter but a sanctuary. He looked at Sarah, who was working in the garden, a picture of quiet grace. He looked at the mountains, the cold, silent world that had been his refuge, and he felt a new kind of purpose. He was not just a survivor. He was a man who had faced his past, who had fought his demons, and who had found a new life. The lonely mountain man was no longer lonely. He was home, and he was ready for a new beginning. The days since Jacob's retreat had settled into a rhythm of profound, simple peace. The constant tension that had coiled around Jed's heart had finally unspooled, replaced by a quiet contentment he had never known. The cabin, once a symbol of his exile, was now a sanctuary, a testament to a life rebuilt on a foundation of trust and mutual respect. The forest, once his harsh and unforgiving master, was now a partner, its bounty a source of comfort, not just survival. The change in Jed was profound. The grim mask he had worn for a decade had softened. His eyes, once a cold and guarded slate, now held a light, a warmth that had not been there before. He moved with a newfound purpose, not just as a man of the wild, but as a man of the home. He spent his days in a quiet dance with Sarah, their tasks intertwined and complementary. He would be felling a tree, his axe strokes powerful and rhythmic, and she would be gathering herbs and berries, her movements a study in grace and quiet efficiency. They talked more now. The silence between them no longer a barrier but a shared space of understanding. They spoke of the simple things, the coming winter, the way the sunlight hit the trees at a certain time of day, the taste of the wild mushrooms Jed had found. But in these simple conversations, they were building a bridge between their two worlds. Jed learned about the quiet, ordered life of the Amish, the importance of faith and community, the simple joys of a life lived in harmony with the land. Sarah, in turn, learned about the wildness of the mountains, the brutal beauty of survival, the deep, abiding loyalty of a man who had chosen to protect her against all odds. One evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Jed looked at Sarah, who was sitting on the floor, mending one of his old shirts. Her face, bathed in the warm glow of the firelight, was a picture of serene beauty. He felt a lump form in his throat, a surge of emotion so powerful and so new that it took his breath away. He was not just protecting her, he was falling in love with her. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. He, a man who had fled from human connection, was now tethered to another soul, a soul so pure and so good that it was a constant source of wonder. He rose and walked to her, his movement slow and deliberate. He knelt before her, his large, calloused hands resting gently on her shoulders. "Sarah," he said, his voice a low, thick rumble. I do not know what I am doing. I am a man of the wild, a man who knows nothing of a woman's heart. But I think I am a different man now, because of you." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes, dark pools of liquid brown, filled with a quiet, knowing light. She had known. She had seen the change in him, had felt the shift in his heart. "You are not a different man, Jedediah," she said softly, her voice filled with an unwavering certainty. "You are the man you were always meant to be, the good man your father saw, the man I knew was there." She reached up and touched his face, her hand soft and warm against his rough beard. The touch was an electric current, a jolt that went straight to his soul. He had never been touched like that before, not with such tenderness, such profound acceptance. He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing, a single tear making a lonely path down his cheek. It was a tear of release, a testament to the 10 years of sorrow he had carried. He took her hand in his large, rough hand dwarfing hers. "I am not a man of words," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I want you to know, I am a man who wants to protect you, not because of a will, not because of a promise, but because you are a part of me now, and I will fight for you, I will fight for us, until the end of my days." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, a soft, beautiful light shining through them. "And I will be with you," she whispered, her voice a promise. "I will be with you." In the silence of the cabin, in the soft glow of the firelight, a new beginning was forged. It was not a grand gesture of love, not a dramatic declaration. It was a simple, unspoken promise, a shared understanding that two broken souls had found their way home, not just to a place, but to each other. The lonely mountain man was lonely no more. He was a man with a shared life, a shared heart, and a shared future. While Jed and Sarah found a new peace in the seclusion of the mountains, the world they had escaped was in turmoil. The small, close-knit Amish community was now a house divided, and the quiet harmony that had defined their lives was shattered by the echoes of Jacob's lies and the brutal truth of Jed's confrontation. The story of the showdown had spread, carried on the winds of gossip and disbelief. The young men who had accompanied Jacob spoke of a man who was not a savage, but a man of quiet honor. They spoke of a man who had defeated Jacob not with brute force, but with a quiet, unwavering strength. The story of Jed's past, of the fire and the betrayal, was also revealed, and many in the community who had known his father as a good man felt a pang of guilt and shame. The community elders called a meeting, a somber gathering in the heart of their meeting hall. Jacob was there, his face a mask of bitter resentment and humiliation. He stood before the elders, his head bowed, a man who had lost everything. He was a symbol of a man whose pride had consumed him, whose lies had unraveled and left him with nothing. Levi, the old elder who had gone to Jed and Sarah, stood before the community, his voice quiet but firm. "I went to Jedediah and Sarah," he said, his eyes scanning the faces of his people. "I saw a man who was not a savage, but a man who was hurt. I saw a woman who was not a pawn, but a person of her own mind. I saw a love that was forged in pain and a future that was built on a foundation of grace." He then told them the truth about the deal between Jed's father and Sarah's, about the secret of her mother's death, and about Jacob's blackmail. He spoke of how Jacob had used a worldly man's will to justify his own pride and greed. The community listened in a stunned silence, their faces a mix of disbelief, anger, and shame. "We have strayed from the path of grace," Levi said, his voice filled with a quiet sadness. "We have allowed one man's pride to divide us. We have judged a man we did not know, and we have punished a woman for seeking freedom. This is not the way of our people. This is not the way of God." Jacob, his face flushed with a final desperate surge of anger, looked up. "He is a worldly man. He is not one of us. He is a man of violence and of sin." "And what are you, Jacob?" Levi's voice was a quiet rebuke. "You are a man who has used God's name to justify your hatred. You are a man who has brought shame to our community. You are a man who has lost his way." The silence that followed was deafening. The elders, after a long deliberation, made their decision. Jacob was sanctioned. He was no longer an elder. He was no longer a respected member of the community. He was a man who had strayed from the path, a man who had to find his way back on his own. The meeting hall was a somber place, a testament to a community that was learning a hard and brutal lesson. The world was not black and white. There were shades of grey, and a man who was a savage to some could be a hero to others. The community was divided, but in the division a new path was being forged, a path of compassion, of understanding, and of grace. The final act of Jed's father had not just saved his son. It had also, in a strange and beautiful twist of fate, saved a community from its own rigid, unforgiving beliefs. The seasons had changed, and with them, Jed and Sarah's lives. The snow had come, a soft, silent blanket that covered the mountains and isolated the cabin from the outside world. It was a world of white, a world of quiet, a world that was theirs and theirs alone. The constant threat of Jacob was now a distant memory, a bitter wind that had come and gone. The cabin was a cozy sanctuary, a warm island in a sea of snow. The days were a simple rhythm of tending to the fire, of mending clothes, of sharing stories in the quiet glow of the lantern. Jed, a man who had once been a stranger to warmth and comfort, now found a deep, abiding joy in the simple domesticity of his life. He was a man of the mountains, a hunter, a provider, but he was also a man who was learning to be a partner, a man who was learning to love. Sarah, in turn, blossomed. The quiet, reserved girl who had arrived with a single satchel was now a woman of quiet strength and profound grace. Her eyes, once filled with sadness, now held a light, a warmth that filled the cabin with a quiet joy. She was no longer a girl running from her past. She was a woman building her future. She taught Jed how to make bread, her hands gentle but firm. She taught him how to sew, a simple act that was filled with a deeper meaning. They were not just surviving. They were building a life. One evening, as the snow fell softly outside, a heavy silence settled over the cabin, a silence that was not empty, but full of unsaid words. Jed, who had been carving a small wooden bird, put down his knife. He looked at Sarah, her face soft in the firelight. "Sarah," he said, his voice a low, thick rumble. I have not asked you, but do you wish to stay? The winter is long, the snow is deep, but when the spring comes, you are free. You are free to go back to your family, to your people, to your world." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, a quiet, beautiful light shining in them. "Jedediah," she said, her voice a soft, loving whisper, "this is my world, and you are my family." She rose and went to him, her movements a study in grace. She took his rough, calloused hands in hers, her touch so soft and so warm. "My father sent me here to protect a secret, to protect our family's honor. But I believe that God sent me here to find you, to find a different life, a life of grace, a life of love. I do not wish to go back. I wish to stay, here, with you, always." Jed felt a lump form in his throat, a surge of emotion so powerful that he could not speak. He had been a man who had lived in the cold, but her words were a warmth, a grace he didn't know he deserved. He reached out and pulled her close, holding her in his arms, his body a shield against the cold, a testament to his love. He was no longer just a man in a cabin. He was a man with a family, an unlikely family forged in pain and bound by love. The lonely mountain man was lonely no more. He was home, and he was finally, truly, happy. Spring came to the mountains with a quiet, powerful force. The snow melted, the rivers ran free, and the land, once a blanket of white, was now a vibrant tapestry of green. The air was filled with the promise of new life, and for Jed and Sarah, that promise was a tangible thing. The garden, which they had tended so carefully in the fall, was now a small but bountiful field of life. The seeds they had planted had taken root, and the soil, once barren, was now a source of sustenance. The first harvest was a cause for quiet celebration. They worked together, their hands in the soil, pulling fresh vegetables from the earth. The bounty was a physical representation of their love, a testament to the life they had built together. Jed, a man who had once been a hunter, a man who had taken from the land, was now a man who was giving back. He was a farmer, a tender of the soil, a man who understood the rhythm of the seasons, the promise of the earth. He was no longer a man who just survived. He was a man who lived. One afternoon, as they were harvesting their first crop of potatoes, a small hand-carved wagon pulled up to the cabin. Jed's hand went instinctively to his rifle, his body a coiled spring. He had been a man of violence, a man of vigilance, and those instincts died hard. But when he saw the face of the driver, he felt a wave of relief wash over him. It was Levi, the old elder, a small, knowing smile on his face. He had brought with him a gift, a small, sturdy, horse-drawn plough. "A gift from some of the younger men," Levi said, his voice a low rumble. "They have heard the truth. They have heard of your love for the land, your love for each other. They see you not as a man who is a savage, but a man who is a partner to the earth." Jed's heart swelled with a new, powerful emotion. The world he had fled was now a world of grace, a world of forgiveness. He had been a man who had been cast out, a man who had been shamed. But in his solitude he had found a new kind of community, a community that was not bound by blood or by faith, but by a shared understanding of grace and a shared love for the land. Sarah, her face filled with a quiet joy, went to Levi and took his hand. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with a profound gratitude. "Thank you for being a man of grace. Levi nodded, his eyes filled with a quiet dignity. "Grace is a gift," he said, "and you, my children, have shown the world that it is the greatest gift of all. You have shown the world that love and grace are more powerful than hatred and pride." He left as quietly as he had arrived, a lone figure in a small wagon, a testament to a world that was slowly but surely changing. Jed and Sarah stood in their garden, their hands in the soil, their hearts filled with a quiet, profound joy. They were a man and a woman, standing on a patch of land that they had tilled with their hands, a patch of land that was now a symbol of their love, a symbol of their new beginning. The lonely mountain man had found his family. He had found his home. He had found his grace. The seasons had come and gone in a gentle, predictable cycle, each one adding a new layer of richness to the life Jed and Sarah had built. The small, rugged cabin, once a symbol of Jed's exile, had blossomed into a bustling, thriving home, a testament to a life built on a foundation of unshakable love and relentless hard work. The garden, which had begun as a small wild patch, was now a flourishing field, its rows of vibrant green and earthy brown providing an abundance that sustained them all year round. Jed, the man who had once been a solitary hunter, a man who had taken only what the unforgiving land would grant, was now a man of the earth, a partner to the soil itself. He had learned the delicate art of planting, the patience of tending, and the profound joy of a bountiful harvest. His hands, once calloused from a decade of survival, were now softened by the touch of soil and the warmth of a life truly lived. He was no longer the lonely mountain man. He was a husband, a father, a man who was a pillar of strength and a beacon of hope for his family. The grim, matted beard of his past was long gone, replaced by a clean-shaven face that revealed the kind lines etched by genuine smiles and the deep wisdom of a life well fought. His eyes, once guarded and cold, were now filled with a deep, abiding love that was a constant source of comfort, a light that banished any remaining shadows. He carried himself with a quiet dignity, the raw power of the mountain man still there, but now channeled into the tender care of his family. Sarah, a woman who had once been a frightened girl running from her past, was now a mother, a wife, a woman who was a testament to the transformative power of grace and the quiet, fierce strength of a woman's heart. Her face, once pale and filled with a lingering sadness, was now radiant with a quiet, profound joy. Her eyes, once dark pools of liquid brown, reflecting a deep well of pain, were now a constant source of light, sparkling with a love that had become the very essence of their home. Her hands, once clasped in silent prayer, now moved with the sure confidence of a woman who knew her place in the world, a place she had helped build from nothing. Their family grew in the quiet of the mountains. They had a son, a small, dark-haired boy, who was the spitting image of his father. He was a testament to their love, a living, breathing symbol of a life that was once thought impossible. The cabin, once a symbol of Jed's exile and solitude, was now a place of joyous laughter, of vibrant life, of endless love. It was a home in every sense of the word, a sanctuary where two broken souls had found a new, perfect wholeness in each other and in the child they had created. The walls, once silent and echoing, now hummed with the sounds of family life, the soft murmur of a lullaby, the joyful shouts of a child at play, the quiet conversations that stretched late into the night. One evening, as their son lay sleeping in a bed built with his father's own hands, a profound peace settled over the cabin. The fire cast a warm, inviting glow on the hand-hewn walls. Jed sat in his favorite chair, a small, worn book held in his large hands. It was the Bible, a book that he had never read, a book that he had once seen as a symbol of the world that had betrayed him, a world of judgment and rigid rules. But Sarah, in her quiet, patient way, had taught him to see it as something else entirely. A book of grace, a book of forgiveness, a book of love. His voice, a low, steady rumble, was a beautiful new melody in the quiet room as he read to her, the ancient words taking on a new, personal meaning in his heart. He looked up from the page, his heart filled with a quiet, profound gratitude that bordered on awe. He was a man who had once lived in the cold, a man who had run from his past as if it were a physical monster. But here, in the gentle warmth of the firelight, with Sarah by his side, he had found a new life, a life that was so much more than he could have ever imagined. The solitude that had once been his only companion was gone, replaced by a deep connection he had never dared to hope for. He had found a family. He had found a home. He had found his grace. He closed the book, his eyes meeting hers across the flickering light. I never thought I would have this," he said, his voice a low, thick whisper, laced with emotion. "A life, a family, a home." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a decade of loneliness and a lifetime of gratitude. Sarah smiled, a soft, loving light shining in her eyes. "Jedediah," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet, certain wisdom. "This is not a life that was given to you. This is a life that you have built, with your hands, with your heart, with your love. This is our legacy, a legacy of love, a legacy of grace." Jed, the man who had been a lonely mountain man, felt a single tear make its slow, lonely path down his cheek. It was not a tear of sadness, but of profound, unshakable joy. It was a tear for the man he had been and for the man he had become. He was a man who had been broken, a man who had been lost. But in the quiet of the mountains, with a woman of grace by his side, he had not only found his way home, he had built it. 10 years had passed since Jed and Sarah had first built their life in the mountains, and those years had been a quiet, beautiful testament to their enduring love. Their son, now a young man, was a testament to the love that had forged them, a living symbol of a new generation born of grace and forgiveness. Jed was an old man now, his hair a shock of pure white, his once powerful body weary from years of relentless hard work, but his mind was still as sharp as a newly honed blade, and his memories were as vivid as the day they happened. He was a man of the earth, a man who had lived a full, rich life, and he carried the wisdom of the mountains in his very bones. He was sitting in his favorite rocking chair by the fire, a well-worn Bible in his lap, the sound of his son's laughter from the fields outside a sweet, familiar melody that was the soundtrack of his contentment. He looked across the room at Sarah, her face now etched with the fine lines of age, and a life lived with unwavering grace and profound love. She was still a beautiful woman, her spirit an ageless light that had never dimmed. The years had only deepened the bond between them, strengthening the love that had been their foundation. He took her hand, his own hand now thin and frail, his voice a low, raspy whisper. "Sarah," he said, his eyes, still clear and filled with love, meeting hers. "I have something I must tell you, a last confession, a final secret that I must lay at your feet before I go." Sarah's eyes, a dark, liquid brown, filled with a quiet concern. She had known for years that there was a part of him that was still hidden, a final shadow that he had not yet let go of. "What is it, my love?" she asked softly, her hand tightening around his. He took a deep breath, the confession a heavy weight that had burdened his soul for a lifetime. "My father," he began, his voice thick with emotion, the words a difficult, painful truth. "The fire, the shame, it was not a lie that was done to him. It was a truth I created. I started the fire. I was a young man, full of a fierce, blinding rage. I was angry at the world, at the men who had wronged my father and broken his spirit. I sought vengeance. I lit a fire near the man's barn, not intending for it to spread, not meaning for it to become a disaster, but it did. It spread like a plague, consuming everything in its path. I was a man of violence, a man of sin. I fled. Not because I was ashamed of what others had done to me, as I let everyone believe, but because I was ashamed of what I had done, what I had become. Sarah's face was a mask of shock and pain. She looked at him, her heart aching for the young, lost boy he had been, for the terrible secret he had carried for so long. She saw the man he was then, a young man consumed by a vengeful rage, a man who had lost his way in the darkness. But she also saw the man he was now, a man of profound grace, a man of unwavering love, a man who had found his way home through the longest, hardest journey of all. The secret did not change him in her eyes. It only deepened her understanding of the man who had fought so hard to find the light. "Jedediah," she said, her voice a quiet, loving whisper, filled with a grace that was as vast as the mountains around them. "That was not you. That was a boy who was lost and who was hurt and who saw no other way. The man you are now, the man who has protected me from a man's pride, the man who has loved me with a love that has healed my soul, the man who has raised our son with a grace that has no equal. That is who you are. The past is a shadow. The future is a light. You have lived a life of grace. You have found your way back to God. You have nothing to be ashamed of." Jed felt a single tear make its lonely path down his cheek, a tear that was the final release of a lifetime of pain. He had carried the secret for so long, a heavy burden that had shaped his life, a secret that had made him the lonely mountain man. But now, in the quiet of his old age with the woman he loved, he was finally, truly free. The last shadow of his past was gone. He was a man who had been forgiven, not just by God, but by the woman he loved, the woman who had seen the truth of his heart from the very beginning. He died in her arms that night, a peaceful smile on his face. A man who had found his grace, a man who had found his home. He had lived a life that was more than just a story. It was a legacy of love, a testament to the power of a woman's grace, and a quiet, beautiful story of a lonely mountain man who had found his way back to the world. A world of grace, a world of love, a world he was finally, truly, a part of. The years passed, and life in the cabin continued, a gentle, enduring testament to the love that had built it. Sarah, a woman of profound grace and quiet strength, carried on, her heart filled with the enduring memory of the man she had loved. She was not a woman in mourning, but a woman filled with a deep, abiding gratitude for the life they had shared, for the love that had healed her and set her free. Their son, now a young man, a testament to his father's legacy, was a man of the mountains, a man of the earth, a man of quiet honor. He had his father's strength and resilience, his mother's grace and compassion, and a deep, abiding love for the land and for his family that was his truest inheritance. He was a new kind of mountain man, a man who had been raised in a home of peace, a home of grace, a home of love. He had married a young woman from a nearby village, a woman who had been drawn to the quiet strength of his family, to the enduring love that had built their home, and to the quiet stories of a lonely mountain man and an Amish girl that had become a local legend. The cabin, once a symbol of exile and solitude, was now a home for a new generation, a home that was filled with the laughter of a child, the warm scent of baked bread, and the quiet, unwavering love that had been the foundation of their lives. It was a place of endless stories, of quiet memories, of a legacy that lived on in every stone of the chimney, in every log of the walls, in every heartbeat within its walls. One evening, as the sun set over the mountains, casting a long, beautiful glow on the peaks, a quiet peace settled over the cabin. The young man, Jed's son, sat by the fire, a small, old, worn book in his hands. It was the Bible, the book that had been his father's, a book that was now a legacy of love, a legacy of grace. He was reading to his young wife, his voice a low, steady rumble, the ancient words taking on a new, powerful meaning in the quiet of their home. "And now abideth faith, hope, charity," these three, but the greatest of these is charity. His wife, a woman of gentle wisdom, looked at him, her eyes filled with a quiet love. "What does it mean?" she asked, her voice a soft whisper, her hand resting on his arm. The young man smiled, his eyes filled with the wisdom of his father and the grace of his mother, looking at the fire. "It means," he said softly, his voice a deep, resonant echo of the man who had raised him, "that love is the most powerful thing of all. It can heal a man who is broken. It can forgive a man who has sinned. It can build a home in a place that was once a prison. It can save a man who is lost, and it can be a legacy that lives on long after we are gone. My father, he built a world, with his hands and with his heart, and he left it for us. A world of grace, a world of love." He looked at the quiet mountains, a place that had once been a place of exile, a place that was now a place of grace. He was a son of the mountains, a son of a lonely mountain man who had found his way home. He was a son of a woman of grace, a woman who had taught him that love was the most powerful force in the world. He was a man of a new generation, a man who was a testament to a story that was not just a story of a man and a woman, but a story of a legacy of love, a legacy of grace. And in the quiet of the night, as the fire crackled in the hearth, the story of the lonely mountain man who had found his grace continued.